Well, my name is James Clarkson, and I would describe myself as a UFO researcher of over 30 years now, formally. If I was going to explain how I got into this, I would say I've always had like two parallel paths in my life since I was very young. I knew at an early age that I wanted to be a policeman, and I managed to do that along the way. I had a 20-year law enforcement career as a police officer for a city on the Washington coast. During that time, I spent 10 years, the last 10 years, as a sergeant. I wore many hats. I've supervised a fatal accident team. I was detective sergeant. I was a field training officer, trained new police officers. I like to be involved in many different activities. I also have been in the Army. I'm a veteran. I was a plainclothes military policeman. That's how I came from the San Francisco Bay Area to the state of Washington, where I've lived ever since. I've been a child abuse detective for 2 years, and I ended up spending 10 years as a fraud investigator for a Washington state agency until I got to retirement age a couple of years ago. But many years ago, when I was a teenager, I was actually influenced by a particular radio program. I was home alone. My parents were gone for the weekend. I remember the whole situation. And a man named John G. Fuller had just come out with a then brand new book called Incident at Exeter, about a series of remarkable UFO sightings in the vicinity of Exeter, New Hampshire in the mid-60s. And in particular, there was a very vivid account of a police officer who was on duty one night who escorted a witness back to the scene where he claimed that he had seen a 50-foot disc with lights going around it. And the disc came back while he was there with the witness, and it startled him so much and it came so low to the ground that he ended up pushing the civilian down, and he started to draw his gun. And then the other officer who was arriving to back him up was jumping out of his car at the same time and screamed at him and said, "Don't do it." And fortunately, he didn't. And I was just fascinated by this. And I was further fascinated because the Air Force said, well, actually, you saw a Stratotanker refueling at 50,000 feet overhead. And I thought, now this is really interesting. Here we have a policeman. We give him a gun and a badge. We let him drive a car. We let him respond to emergencies. And his eyesight is so bad that he can't tell the difference between something that's coming down so low that he might get flattened under it and an airplane flying across the sky at 20 or 30,000 feet. What's wrong with this picture? And that's been my question all my life. And I'm the kind of investigator, I'm always looking for what doesn't fit. I'm looking for the thing that doesn't match the pattern. I want to know the deeper meaning. I want to understand what's going on. And so I feel that these things fit together really well. And I cannot think of one subject that is more possibly significant and important to the human race than answering the question, number one, are we alone? And number two, if we're not alone, have we been contacted? Are we being contacted? Has our entire existence on this world been influenced by other more intelligent beings? Are we being manipulated now? These are all significant questions, and I'm endlessly fascinated. But you got to remember that I'm not doing this based upon my experience, because I'm waiting for my own particular experience. I would love to have one. I'm frequently jealous of the people I get to interview because they have these extraordinary experiences, and I'm still waiting. But as a policeman, I didn't have to see the crime to build a case and make an arrest. I had to constantly, in my mind, be talking to a person who doesn't exist. That person is the rational man. This is a person you carry around with you, and as you examine the evidence and the testimony and the credibility of your witnesses, you ask yourself, what would a rational man conclude if he was confronted with the evidence that I am confronted with right now? What conclusion would you draw? Because what I'm all about is not so much convincing me. I'm looking for evidence that will help other people better understand this phenomena. That's what my presentation was all about. I was trying to sum up 30 years of my interest in the field of UFO research and give other people a basic perspective that they could take with them to examine the phenomena on their own. I try very hard not to tell people what this is, because I don't know. I just know that it's real. I know that it's a profound mystery, and I know that our media, for a variety of reasons, does not properly represent it to the public at large. And it's only at events like this, the conference at Eureka Springs, and a few other places, where people have a chance to be exposed to what's really going on. If I was going to pick one particular investigation, there's no doubt in my mind the first thing that pops into my head is June Crane. And the reason is because of the situation. It was meeting a woman who had a story to tell that I absolutely did not expect that she was going to reveal the things that she did. This lady, when I first met her in 1993, was the classic stern elderly lady in the city of Ocean Shores, the classic elderly woman that you didn't want to mess with. She had a reputation for being very stern, very direct, real blunt with people. In fact, she stood up to a man who was definitely connected with the mob and went toe-to-toe with him because she didn't like his decision in the community. My friend June ended up single-handedly going and getting a lot of donations that led to them building a new library in the community out there. Ocean Shores is a city on the southwest coast of Washington State. It was about 25 miles from where I was a policeman for 20 years in Aberdeen, Washington. But I met June because part of what I do is public outreach. I give lectures in libraries and any organization where they want a speaker on the subject of UFOs. I feel that it's part of what I do. I want people to know, so I try to give them this basic information. Well, after this one particular talk, this elderly lady approaches me and she says, "You're right. The government knows all about UFOs and they're not telling the truth." And I could tell by looking at her that this was a very serious person. And I said, "How do you know?" And she said, "I worked there." And I said, "Will you tell me more?" And she said, "I can't. They'll come and arrest me." And I think she was a little bit afraid of me because at the time I was giving this lecture, I was the detective sergeant for the Aberdeen Police Department, and I didn't keep that a secret. And I think she thought I would arrest her. But I gave her a business card and I said, "If you ever change your mind, you want to talk to me, please call me." It took 4 years for that to happen. 1997, fast forward. That's a big year for UFOs, huge year. We have the Phoenix Lights on March 13th, which is an incredibly important event in the history of UFOs. I mean, you could go on and on about that. Then we have the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash coming up on the July 4th weekend. And I am sure that the secret keepers in the government knew that they were in trouble that year. Because as it turned out, the way it was best described to me, there were so many people who showed up in Roswell, New Mexico, that they had to hire off-duty policemen from all over the state just to do traffic control, because there were all these raving UFO people who were there to celebrate the big birthday. Meanwhile, the Air Force decided that the best way to counter the whole thing was to publish a book called Roswell Case Closed. And they talked about weather balloons and they talked about dummies. And I actually, later on, parenthetically, interviewed the man who was in charge of the dummy drop research. He is now a retired Air Force veteran, and he is very angry with the Air Force because they misused a program that he was very proud of in order to explain away the aliens that were involved in the Roswell situation. So that's kind of an interesting parenthetic note. But we've got to back up here. Roswell case closed comes out on the news. Because it's the Air Force, because this is a hot topic, CNN, it just explodes across the media. All the networks were carrying a story about Roswell case closed. June, out in Ocean Shores, sees it on her television. My phone rings. It's June. Haven't heard from her in 4 years. I pick up the phone. She says, "It's a damn lie." And I said, "Good to hear from you, June." So I started talking to her. She starts telling me, "That's the same lie that we used to tell the public when I worked there." Worked where? Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I come to find out that she worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when she was a young woman between 1942 and 1952. She grew up in Dayton, Ohio. She told me about the night that Pearl Harbor happened. They didn't even have a fence around Wright Field until then. And I mean, she knew all the history. I said, "How soon can I come to your house?" I started visiting her. She was a night owl. I would work patrol duty on afternoon shift, get off at 9 o'clock in the evening, change into civvies, drive the 20 or 30 miles to her house, and we would sit up half the night drinking coffee and swapping life stories. And even if she had not told me a thing about UFOs, I would have been fascinated to hear her story. A woman working in an all-male environment under high security. She had a Q-level security clearance. In her office, this is pre-internet, no computers, she was in charge of safes. She had to log in and log out folders that were top secret. You had to have the right security clearance and a need to know. Along the way, she talked to scientists and engineers who were directly involved in UFOs. In other words, they had been present in the Southwest doing research on our early rocket program. They came back with stories talking about how they felt they were under surveillance by UFOs while they were there. They went on from there. They said they would no longer report them officially because every time they made a UFO report, they got locked up for 24 hours and debriefed. And after you've had to repeat the same story 15 times and have people tell you you didn't see what you know you saw, you quit reporting them. I mean, that's easy. But amongst themselves, they still talked about UFOs. An officer came in one day who was clearly flirting with her, pulled a piece of metal out of his pocket that weighed nothing, that was indestructible, and invited June to tear it up. She couldn't do anything to it. She couldn't cut it, couldn't dent it. You wadded it up into a ball, it returns to its original shape, flows like water. Everybody in the UFO field knows what that is. That's the Holy Grail. That's the memory metal. That's the metal that everybody wants, and nobody quite knows how to get it. But June actually handled a piece of it. And when the officer, after he was done showing it to her, June says, "What is this?" And the guy says, "It's a piece of a spaceship." And she says, "Oh, come on, what is it really?" And the guy says, "It's a piece of a spaceship." And about that time, another officer walks through the room. He grabs it, sticks it in his pocket, and pretends like they weren't talking. Well, June's story goes on from there. There's numerous details. And the thing was, what she had not told me, she claimed that her cancer was in remission. It apparently wasn't that much in remission. But I remember when I first got to talk to her again in 1997, I said, "Why are you willing to talk to me now and you weren't willing to talk to me 4 years ago?" She says, "I'm 72 years old. My cancer's in remission. I've outlived 2 husbands. What are they going to do? Shoot me or put me in prison? I can do either one." Well, I mean, that's my kind of witness. You know, I mean, she's like the dream witness. But this is the case that I knew had the biggest potential implications of anything that I was ever involved in. Although the crazy part was that unfortunately, sadly, in the middle of 1998, she died. And when I talked to her the last time, and I knew this was our last conversation, very probably, and I said, what do you want me to do, June? And she just looked at me and said, I want you to tell my story. So I used that as the title of the book. I mean, it's a perfect title. Tell My Story, June Crane, the Air Force, and UFOs. But I didn't even have any idea then I was going to write a book. I didn't know. I had all this information, had no idea what to do with it until a couple years later, it was 1999, I was on duty one night and it was snowing. I remember that. I was down by the Chehalis River in Aberdeen. There was nothing going on in town. Nobody was moving. I listened to the Art Bell show on the AM radio. Bob Wood and Ryan Wood were talking about the Majestic documents, and they had an 800 number. And of course, this is before those things were all free on the internet. So nobody knew how to get the Majestic documents. I was excited when I heard all this stuff. So I called this number the next day and I said, I would like to get copies of those documents, and oh, by the way, I'm a police sergeant up here in this town in the Pacific Northwest, and I have this story from this woman who worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio between 1942 and 1952, and she's telling me about crashed UFOs, and she also handled a piece of the memory metal, and I have all the personal papers from her that prove that she worked there. Boom, next thing I know, I get a phone call, and it's a travel agent wanting me to come to this place in Newport Beach. So I ended up, they were very gracious, and they invited my wife along too. My wife has 2 master's degrees, one in library science and the other in English. So they brought her along as a research assistant, very graciously. And I went to this place and I walked in this room and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Here were all these people. I had all their books on my shelf at home. I got to meet Linda Moulton Howe, Jim Mars, Paul Davids, who wrote the screenplay for the movie Roswell. There were all these other people there that I thought, I'm in strange company now. But that clearly is the one situation, that one witness. You never know when you meet a witness where it's going to go. And that is certainly, without a doubt, the case that opened doors for me, took me into new worlds, gave me an insight into things that I never thought I would be involved in. And so what I'm all about now is trying to pass that on to other people and get them to ask their own questions and do their research. I would add that during the interviews that I did with June, she told me that by the time she left in 1952, that there were people talking about not 1, but 3 UFO crash retrievals, and she thought that there could have been more. Now, she did not have access to everything, and what she was working on, although it was top secret, was not directly UFO related, except for she did tell me that she occasionally got tasked with writing letters back to people saying, from an engineering standpoint, the vehicle that you have described could not possibly fly. The Air Force is declining to, it was boilerplate letters. So in that extent, she was involved in UFOs. There were a lot of, things that she heard. And this is one of those situations where I wish there was more. But with June, one of the things that I liked and respected was that if she didn't know, she didn't know, and if she didn't remember, she would tell you that. And it was very clear to me where to draw that line between things that I could firmly, were definite firm memories, and things that she wasn't quite sure of, but that she had heard. She told me, for instance, that the bodies were stored in the Aeromed lab. She also told me about the morning that a friend of hers, who was he was a master sergeant who was flying on military cargo planes. She said she knew all these people. In fact, she gave me one of this old Polaroid photo that was fading of some of the pilots that she knew, all in a group photo. I still have that photo. And one of them came in one morning and he was very upset. And they were all having coffee together. And everybody said, well, what's wrong? And this man says, His name was Master Sergeant Clarence. We never, in fact, got his last name, but I even have a picture of his wedding, which June gave me, which was on the base. Well, Master Sergeant Clarence says, well, there was a crash in New Mexico, and we brought back bodies and pieces of wreckage. And this is one of those really strange conversations, because everybody at the table assumed that he was talking about perhaps someone that they knew who had died in an accident involving a military aircraft. And so they're having this conversation, and he finally says, you don't understand. They're not human. And he said they were like the size of children, and they were kind of a blue-gray color. You know, that was one of her remarkable revelations. So, you know, there were a few anecdotes like that. This is why I've described June as a key corroborating witness to Roswell. She's not a direct witness, but the beauty of her situation is that we can absolutely prove that she worked where she said she worked, and we know that she worked on top secret material because, for instance, she talked to me about working on something called Project Caucasian. At the time that she died in 1998, I asked other UFO researchers, what is Project Caucasian? Have you ever heard of it? Nobody had any idea what I was talking about. 2 or 3 years later, it got declassified. Project Caucasian was a code name for the engineering effort to construct a parachute harness that would hold a hydrogen bomb when it was dropped out of the back end of a bomber. And needless to say, that's top secret. She even knew the name of the top engineer, who was a Project Paperclip scientist who formerly worked for the Germans, who was brought to the United States after World War II to head up these efforts. It took a couple of years before I tracked his background down and proved that he was exactly who he said he was. All of these details that June gave me turned out to be verifiable. So she, you know, no witness is ever as good as you might hope. No one's perfect. In fact, as an investigator, it would worry me if they were. But she was an extraordinary person in the right place at the right time to be able to say the things that she was sure of. I think a lot about where ufology is and where it's going. I am worried. I am worried because there are some other trends that influence it. People tend to only want what is sensational, what's flashy, what's gimmicky, what looks good, and a lot of people don't want to look beneath the surface. They don't want to spend the time to read or do the research or assess credibility. And there are organizations and there are people who will only put out there things that will sell. There's way too much commercialism in ufology. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, I like as well as anybody, I like alien doodads and posters and all of that kind of thing, and that's fun. But it's not fun when you try and convince other people that a film that depicts an object that was created with computer-generated imagery is the real thing. Too many people are willing to run with, on Facebook or some other application, the first thing they see, oh, this is a UFO. And we don't know who the photographer is. We don't know when it was taken. We don't know what device was used to capture the image. Those are all excellent investigative questions, but frequently no one even addresses them. So there are so many areas in ufology where it's a little too glib and glitzy, and it's going a little too fast. Investigations take time. They're not instant, and you have to do the work. And a lot of people are not willing to do that. So that's where I'm alarmed. At the same time, we've got some, extremely dedicated researchers out there, many of whom are right here. at this conference, that are doing extraordinary work. The positive note in all this is that I'm beginning to get a sense that as researchers, we're beginning to see that this solution may be much deeper than just seeing nuts and bolts spacecraft that have, robots and aliens piloting them around the sky. There may be a deeper, almost spiritual truth behind this. I hesitate to say that as an investigator because, in some circles, you can be pilloried for just suggesting that. But I do think that one of the best things that will come out of UFO research is a deeper and truer connection to the universe. And that's where I'm hopeful. That's where I'm optimistic. So I guess if I had to sum up ufology, it really is like the opening lines of The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's it. In the last several years, the best UFO investigation that I've had was on July 2nd of 2014 over the city of Vancouver, Washington. Now, Vancouver, Washington is directly across the river from Portland, Oregon, separated by the Columbia River. Vancouver, Washington is in Washington State. When you cross the bridge, you're in Oregon. So don't confuse this with Vancouver, British Columbia. A man was on duty. This man works for one of the three-letter agencies of the United States government. This man was a law enforcement officer. He has arrest powers, he's armed, he's highly trained, he's in the prime of his life, he's a family man. I know who he is. I've communicated with him numerous times, and I've met him in person twice. But back on July 2nd of 2014, I never heard of him. About 6 or 7 days later, my cell phone rings, and this man is very reluctant on the phone. He doesn't want to tell me who he is. He doesn't want to tell me where he works, but he said that something really strange happened and he needed to talk to somebody about it. And the phrase that popped up immediately was, he said he was desperately hoping that what he saw had a conventional explanation. What he saw was a metallic, disc-shaped aircraft flying over the city of Vancouver, Washington in broad daylight on a sunny day at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on July 2nd, 2014. He sees this object fly directly across the sky. He can see that it tilts slightly. He can see the gleam of metal. He can see the shadow underneath it. He's convinced that it's a three-dimensional, physical, tangible aircraft, except it has no wings, no propellers, no jet engines, nothing that would make it conventional. He could not hear any noise from it, but you could take that either way given the location. So he's telling me all of this, and he says that when it gets 2/3 of the way across the sky, he's telling me, he says, I haven't told you the weird part. I said, what's the weird part? Obviously. He said, when it got 2/3 of the way across the sky, it looked as if someone drew a line in the air. And as the craft crossed the line, it wasn't there anymore. It was just gone. He saw a ripple in space, and then there was just nothing. So he's looking at this, and he's in shock because this isn't right. It doesn't make any sense to him at all. Within 30 seconds, here comes an F-15 fighter plane on afterburners going in the same direction. Obviously from the Portland Air National Guard, which there's a small group of F-15 fighters on standby all the time at the Portland International Airport. So I get all this information from him. We agree that I will not reveal his name. I have not revealed his name even to MUFON. I won't. So we determined that he should write me a complete statement. He does. Because of this man's training and experience, I get a report that's like the best report I've ever received. I mean, this man knows how to write an investigative report. So that part of my job was really easy. Because the report was so recent, I called my good friend William Puckett, who runs UFOs Northwest, who is a retired NOAA weatherman. He has like 30 years on the job, and he has forgotten more about radar than most people will ever learn. And I asked him to write a Freedom of Information Act request to get the radar data from the FAA. He does. He unpacks the data for me. We examine the data, and it's determined that in the area of the sky over Vancouver, Washington, in the same area where the individual observed the UFO disappear into the sky, there are unidentified solid returns. These are something blocked the radar for 2 passes of the radar that did not have a transponder associated with it. In other words, there was no identifier. A normal airplane has a transponder that's called squawking, where it's constantly broadcasting its serial number and its location and saying, hey, I'm a friendly, don't shoot me down. And only military aircraft are allowed to turn off their transponders, and only under special circumstances, and that does not include flying over a metropolitan area near a major international airport. That would be a big no-no. And so we have the unidentifieds, and we clearly have the radar track of the F-15 going across the sky. This is what you call a really, really good UFO report. I have a highly credible professional individual who makes a report of a broad daylight sighting of a solid UFO that has definite form and shape. It performs in ways that apparently can't be duplicated by conventional aircraft. It disappears in a way that no conventional aircraft can duplicate that I know of. And it's being chased by the US government, and my witness is risking his entire career to make this report. He's not making any money. He gains nothing by making this report. It doesn't get any better than that unless I could bring you the UFO on a trailer. This man is extraordinary. I'm still in communication with him, and in fact, like many of my best witnesses, we have ongoing correspondence where I am helping him read books and get more information on the subject of UFOs. I'm not going to be able to tell him exactly what UFO he saw. I mean, I can't tell him that it's a Aldebaran star cruiser with a bad taillight and a faulty muffler. That's not going to happen. But I can show him that there are many other people like him, pilots, military people, policemen, normal citizens who are sane, sober, serious people who have all had similar experiences. He's not alone. There's nothing wrong with him. What there is something really extraordinary going on that is not being properly addressed by our government or by the media for a whole variety of reasons. So that's my favorite UFO case. Trying to sum up how I feel about this entire process. It's the most necessary part is that whatever you do has to be done with integrity. That's why I am very, very careful where I draw the line between what I am reasonably certain of and where I am just speculating. I think it is all important in this field for everybody, the researchers and the public at large, to know the difference between those two things so that we don't jump to conclusions. At the same time, I really believe that we have to approach this subject with an open heart and a sense of compassion. Fear will not solve this. Fear will only lead us into more confusion and down a much darker path. I really think that we are going to reach a point, and that's my hope in this entire effort, is that there will come a day when we are no longer people of any particular race, religion, or nation, we will be the Terrans. We are the people of Earth, the noisy, ornery bunch of strange human being creatures that live on the third planet from the sun. And my hope is that that will be a very proud day. I'm looking for that day when we will meet them openly as friends, not as enemies. Because yes, could there be aliens out there that will be hostile to us or completely indifferent? Of course there could be. They may have already been here. But at the same time, there's a very strong possibility that this will be a surprising family reunion. And I would add to that, in conclusion, that if anyone wants to reach me, they should do so through my email, which is uforeality@comcast.net, or I have a website, jamesclarksonufo.com.